I do think that founding a company is very much like having a kid, right? So I am pretty sure you can attest to that as well.
Yeah, I agree.
So if you can actually have a kid and the kid's thriving, I think that there's no reason to doubt why you can also be a good founder.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you again, Jeremy.
It's been over 2 years since our last recording. I felt like it was a good way for us to catch up and talk about some of the things you learned along the way.
Sure.
Yeah, so for those who want to know more about your backstory, about why you started the company, obviously they can refer to the audio recording that we made 2 over years ago.
I believe there was
There's a
another
video
one as
recording as
well.
well.
Yes.
Who knows whether it's still up. But at least it's still there. The transcript is still there.
I hope so.
And we'll look to it in the transcript here so that people can look at it.
All right.
And so we want to talk a little bit about maybe just like your business and go through a little bit that and also the evolution of that business over the past 2 years, both on the professional side, but also maybe on the personal side as well. I think the formulation of how you define a company is different from how you formulated it 2 years ago from my
Slightly
perspective,
different,
right?
yes.
And I think for me, when I heard it 2 years ago, it was very much about taking over the devices, the IT support to some extent, and now you're mentioning the whole process. So can you tell me about how that shift happened?
Yeah, and the shift really happened as a result of what we learned from our customers along the way. So as you alluded to, when we started out, we really started out with procurement. We were helping companies with globally distributed teams to procure IT devices, IT peripherals in all the different countries around the APAC region and then eventually globally as well. But then what we found from that gradually was that people didn't just need help with buying devices. They needed help with setting up the devices. They needed help with like repair support when something went down. And obviously they also needed help with offboarding as well. So if an employee offboards in India and you don't have an office over there, you need someone to collect the device, to clean the device, to store it over there, eventually to redeploy it to someone new that you get in. So that was then where we expanded the services. And after we did that, we heard feedback from even more clients to say, hey, now that you're doing this for us, we have also experienced some problems as well. My employee got a phishing email the other day. We have discovered that some of our devices are missing in our Excel sheet that we're keeping and so on. So we discovered that, for our group of client profile, a lot of them are actually looking to outsource this management of IT to an external party, right? So they may have a lean in-house IT team, or maybe they don't even have an IT team, but they really need help with the complexity of managing IT, and they understand that they need this in order to scale their businesses as well.
Yeah.
So now it's a very comprehensive suite of IT services, no longer just procurement and like device lifecycle management in other countries, but we also help them to manage their devices and the security of those devices. We even educate their employees on cyber hygiene risk and help them with endpoint protection as well.
And I think what's interesting as well is that going through the stack where you're following the customers from a bottom-up perspective, but also, from a strategy perspective, it's just following the customer and cross-selling every module that they want. I'm just curious, why didn't you envision this 2 years ago? That would be the negative version of this, right? Because I think at the start, we all have this idea about what it is. So why do you think that you didn't see that 2 years ago, or why is it that you learned it along the way from your perspective?
Yeah, I wish I did see it 2 years ago, but I think when we started during that period of time, what we did was that we kept a very open mind. We did know that this was the way that work was going, that work was becoming global. The geographical barriers between countries was disappearing because of remote and hybrid work, and all this was due to COVID, right? But we were not sure during our customer discovery at that point in time whether companies just needed help with just procurement, and that was just what they were looking for, or whether they needed help just with device lifecycle management. We did have a thesis that they would need something that is more comprehensive, that encompasses the whole. But we didn't want to draw any conclusions and invest a lot in building up an entire platform only to find at the end that customers didn't really need it. So we took it as a kind of like step-by-step iteration, and I think that really helped as well. Because what happened is that before a company would go with you in something as fundamental shift as changing their device management and security software. They want to know you first and they want to trust you. I think especially here in the Asia context. So that was how they started out with us. They came with us in a low stakes kind of way where they started doing procurement with us and then device lifecycle management. And then they're like, I know this is a company I can trust. They're very responsive. They are very professional and they provide great service. And then they ask us to do more for them. So I think that there's also a level of trust as well that we have earned with our customers.
And I think what's interesting is that I think it makes total sense, right? Because from my perspective, as somebody who's an executive, is in a bucket of things I don't want to manage.
Your time is much too valuable for this.
Exactly. I don't want to handle where the procurement for what is the lowest price for a Lenovo laptop is. And I definitely don't want to handle it when they forget their password. That's the last thing I want to handle. And it keeps coming up over and over again. So I think there's a whole kind of like bucket of stuff that I just don't want to touch it. I guess what's interesting is, what's the sales process for that? Because for me, I don't want to think about it. And I probably try to delegate it as much as possible. So what's the right sales process from your perspective for, because I think it's different where I'm like, okay, Jeremy wants to do AI and he wants to automate this for revenue. So he's going to go out there, he's going to put a team together to do like a task force to meet the demos. I'm going to be there to meet vendor. I'm going to proactively choose, and then I'm going to call a few friends and I'm going to choose the one that's like, okay, this is the thing that's going to bring, I don't know, something with productivity or whatever it is, but this is something I don't want to touch. And like, it's probably also been passed down to a level 2, level 3 manager already as well. So what's that sales process like?
So it took us a while also to discover the sales process for this. But what the sales process is, the most effective sales process we have discovered is actually to approach you when your pain is highest. So not exactly to approach you, but approach your manager to whom you have delegated this to when the pain is the highest. So as to when that is, it could be, a couple of situations, right? It could be when you're ramping up your hiring of people overseas. We would see that somewhere in some sort of job board. It could be when we know that you are potentially looking at some sort of certification to help your business to grow. So those are the points in time that we approach customers like you to say, hey, this is something that you can totally outsource to us. We've done this for dozens or hundreds of companies before, and this is something that we can help you with.
And in my head, would a cybersecurity breach, was that a moment of high stress? Or would it just be like, oh, I'm going to look for some sort of cybersecurity resolution vendor?
Yeah, I would think that at the moment of a cybersecurity breach, people's thoughts go mostly to, how am I going to pay this ransomware? Right? How am I going to resolve this? How am I going to get all my servers back in order? So it is not something that they would automatically think about. It is like maybe a person receiving a critical illness kind of diagnosis. Immediately after that, they'll be looking for the surgeon, but they're not necessarily looking for a personal trainer or nutritionist to help them get their health back in order again. That is something that will happen maybe a couple of months after the cybersecurity breach.
Right, makes sense. And I guess one question I have for you is that if that is the case, how do you generate leads? Because right now it's all about, I don't know, is it like looking at LinkedIn, like you said? Is it based on conferences? Because I think a lot of folks try to struggle, right? It's like B2B, it's such a slog. B2C is okay, if it's my ads, everybody likes coffee and they like sugar and they like fat and you put them together, right? You're like, wait, is it a CEO? Is it a CFO? Is it the head of IT? Like, how do you think about it?
Yeah, so for us, we actually do have a methodology for doing it, which is proving very effective. It's something that we have came across like about 6 months ago. So I can't reveal like the secret sauce of this on the podcast, but suffice to say it is based on trigger point. And it's also based on us understanding our ideal client profile very well, and also profile matching our current client pool against prospective client pool. So it's really a triangulation of all these things.
And I think when you think about that, obviously you've evolved the company, I think not just in terms of products, but also in terms of geography. So in the start, I remember it was like primarily Southeast Asia. Now I think it's much more of a global view. So could you share a little bit about the evolution? Yeah,
the evolution was also natural and driven by customers as well. So when we started out, we mainly had Southeast Asian, I would say Singapore kind of clients. But slowly over time, we have had clients based overseas who came to us because of our APAC expertise. So I think you understand as well, Jeremy, if you travel a lot around the region, it is not exactly easy getting a laptop from Singapore into Indonesia or from Singapore to India. It's actually very difficult, harder than getting a laptop from Singapore, say, to the US, right? So APAC is really our sweet spot in terms of our knowledge of navigating all these things, the very strong local kind of partnerships that we've had. And coincidentally, there are many companies in the US and in the EU who are hiring in India and in the Philippines and in Vietnam and Indonesia as well. So what we're really helping them to do is to equip their teams in like the Philippines and India in a very seamless kind of way. And when we do that for them, they then get us to also then support their team members who are in the EU or in the Latin kind of area. So it's a very natural extension of what we were doing in the beginning.
Pardon me if this is a silly question, but what's so hard about moving a laptop from Singapore to Indonesia from your perspective?
Customs and also lithium-ion battery as well.
Really? Okay,
Yes.
yeah, that's fair. Wait, lithium-ion battery, isn't that to do your check-in?
Sorry?
Isn't it, don't you just put in your check-in?
Yes, but you're not going to send someone flying with every laptop that you're going to send overseas, right? And that's going to be a very expensive way of doing it. That said, we did have one client who was actually getting their IT manager to fly with every 2 laptops that they were onboarding, right? And that was actually how we got started with this business. Because he was doing it from Malaysia into Indonesia and he was married. And eventually his wife was like, what are you doing? Why are you flying into Indonesia every single week? So created HR kind of issues. So it's not something that is possible to sustain going forward.
Okay. But he was basically like being a mule for 2
laptops, yes.
Because I'm a laptop mule.
But it's something that you cannot easily explain to your wife. Imagine if you were flying to like Thailand, right? Every single week.
I'm not smuggling drugs here. Smuggling laptop.
Yeah, but tough time explaining it to family members.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think what's interesting is that when you think about this, do people think about it as replacing an IT department or is it like augmenting? How do people think about it from your perspective?
It's definitely not replacing an IT department. I think that for companies of a certain size and beyond, it really makes sense to get a good IT manager on board. So I would say that if your company at like the 200, 300 people kind of level, you should have an IT manager on board, especially if your teams are in-house in one country. However, how I describe ourselves is for the larger companies, we are more of an augmentation of their IT teams. So what that means is that the IT person may himself be based here in Singapore, but he has team members in the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. How's he going to manage them? A lot of things do actually need to be done in country. So that's where he relies on us to extend that support, to support those team members over there in terms of procurement of laptops, onboarding of people, in terms of offboarding and storage in those locations, and even repair support as well. We are like an extension of his IT team there. But conversely, we also do have other clients with smaller headcounts where they're like, we're still too early to hire an IT manager. So for us, what we really want is someone who can guide us on what are the fundamentals that we need in terms of IT management, in terms of device security. And they also start to understand as well when they try to increase their revenue that, hey, if I do not have ISO 27001, if I don't have GDPR, if I don't have SOC 2, it's going to be difficult for me to get government contracts, increasingly, especially nowadays. I'm not sure whether my employees are updating their laptops and I may be at risk of a phishing attack or ransomware, and the government now has very heavy fines for this. I don't want to be at risk of that. Esevel, can you come in and help me set up this infrastructure to make sure that these things don't happen?
What's the point of ISO 27001, SOC 2, GDPR? I think I understand about the privacy side. But for those two, obviously not many folks understand the value of that. So can you explain what the value of those certificates would be?
Yes, it may seem just like paper certificates, but it's really not that, right? It's about how you want to treat like your own internal IT security. So for one, yes, you could treat it as a nice mark to have at the bottom of your website, and you could tell all your clients, right? So usually if you have MNC clients, they are either going to give you a 200-page IT security questionnaire that you have to tick off and you make certain declarations about, or you can just show them your ISO certificate and say, I'm certified, right? And you can trust me with regards to this. So it's all about revenue generation. If you want to get bigger contracts from bigger clients, these are the kind of certifications that you need to get. Otherwise, you need to endure like lengthy IT security contracts, and you also need to take liability as well if certain things were to happen.
And how does insurance play into this? Because obviously,
great question.
Like we're talking about ISO 27001, SOC 2, like these are security certifications.
Yes.
GDPR obviously is more about respecting privacy data, but I would say that this tranche is really about security, and obviously the next is attacks, right? And then after that's insurance. So how should companies be thinking about that?
With insurance, I'm guessing that you're alluding to cybersecurity insurance, right? So in many cases, and we've seen from our clients as well, the cybersecurity insurers wouldn't even allow you to apply if you do not have the basics set up. So definitely if you have ISO 27001 or SOC 2, the insurers are going to be like, okay, you can tick a lot of the buckets. But if you don't have those certifications and you don't have the basics set up, so for instance, you do not even have a good antivirus kind of system, don't track your asset, you don't know whether your laptops are updated in terms of their operating systems or in terms of the software, they are not going to insure you, like in terms of cybersecurity insurance, right? Which also means that you are then potentially exposed as well to a lot of liability if something were to happen.
Yeah. And I think the interesting piece is that there's this linear, I think, part where every company has to think about it. What are the thresholds you think that people need to be thinking about? Like 100 employee mark, I think you mentioned 200 employees threshold. How should people be thinking about
in terms of ISO?
ISO, but also general practices around cybersecurity and IT management. Yeah.
I would say that at any stage, companies should actually be thinking about it. I mean, there was a recent Bloomberg article that came out, and we were just writing a blog post about this. The majority of victims of cyber attacks are actually SMEs. They are not MNCs. And why is that? It's because SMEs are low-hanging fruits. Most of the hackers out there, they know that SMEs do not have an IT team that has set up an IT kind of defense perimeter around the company. You could send the employees phishing emails, if someone clicks on it, there we go, right? You are potentially maybe going to ask for $1 or $2 million of Bitcoin from that company. So it's a very lucrative thing for those kind of companies. So I would say that SMEs and startups are actually more at risk as compared to MNCs for these kind of things. But the question that you're asking is, when should companies start thinking about ISO 27001 SOC 2? So for this, it depends, I would say, on size and on industry. So certain kind of industries, especially in the financial services, so think about fintech companies or payments companies or even VC firms or PE firms as well. It is actually an MAS rule that you would need to fulfill a lot of requirements, which are the same requirements that an ISO standard would require you to fulfill. Healthcare companies, very similar. So there's a bill coming out soon by MOH, which also requires this kind of like cybersecurity guidelines to be fulfilled. And these kind of like industries that are handling a lot of PII, which is like personally identifiable kind of information, they would need to have these kind of certifications. And these are part of like industry standards. But for companies that don't fall under these kind of industries, I would say that they should start thinking about it. Not necessarily going to the extent of saying, okay, I need to get an ISO cert, but definitely to the extent of saying, okay, I need to have proper antivirus, I need to have like proper IT security measures in place. They should start thinking about it when they have revenues that they feel should be protected, right? So of course, if someone had just founded a company, maybe less than 10 employees, not generating revenue, but trying to find product market fit, they don't really need to bother about this at this stage. But once revenues come to a point where you say, I have something worth protecting, right? Then that's when they should start thinking about it. And it doesn't need to be difficult. So you can tailor your IT security requirements for the stage of your company.
And, kind of like slowly changing tacks here is like, how have you evolved as a founder over the past 2 to 4 years?
So when I started out, I would say that I felt that I had to do many different things and I had to do them well. And that made it difficult for me to handle like all the responsibilities that was coming in at the same time. At one moment, I would be doing sales, and at another moment doing marketing and so on. But what I found over the course of the few years is that it is really about knowing how to delegate well. And what I mean by that is the person that you hire, are you hiring someone that you can trust? Are you hiring someone that can grow? So really the definition in the very first place of what are the type of people you want to hire? What is the culture of the company? Can you trust the people that you hire? And then can you define like the job that you're going to give them? And can you define what success means when they have that in the job? So how I've really grown is that I have started to understand the importance of this and put a lot more emphasis on this in the beginning, like rather than trying to make everyone run a marathon with me to the end as well.
Yeah. And when you think about that change, it almost feels like a no-brainer, right? In some ways, right? Because you're like, you hear that all the time, right? You can't do everything. You have to delegate. You have to find the right people to do it. So I'm just curious how that evolution shifted, because I hear that all the time, and frankly, I also do everything all the time. So it's not as if I practice what I preach, but I just kind of,
There's a difference between intellectually knowing something and actually believing in it, in your bone and in your heart. So I think that was what happened. Like when you realize that it's no longer possible to pull the entire sleigh by yourself, and you have to enlist people that are even better than you to come along with you to help you with it. How do you motivate them? How do you select them? How do you tell them when they have done well and when they can improve? Yeah, so that is really, I think, a process of leadership that I've learned over the past 1-2 years.
And I think what's interesting is that that's a set of changes that you have to make. Has there been any particular moments or examples of that lesson coming into play for yourself?
Yeah, it has, I would say, a couple of months ago. So we were experiencing some challenges at a point in time with a team within the company. I brought in a friend of mine who is very experienced. I was so lucky to get her in because she had just recently retired from a very high level position in that exact same scope of responsibility. I brought her in to see how my people were doing. And at the end of the session, she turned around to me and she said, you should stop trying to do so many things yourself, right? She said, instead, configure the team and tell them that what you're aiming for is a high performance team and that you have high expectations of them and you have high standards. Set those standards and make sure that they abide by it and then reward them for that. And that was when I realized that even though I intellectually understood the same thing that you did, I wasn't actually practicing it myself. I needed a third party coming in to see what I was doing, what the team was doing, to tell me that, hey, even though you think that you're doing this, but actually you're not, right? But it also took a certain amount of humility for me to accept that from her as well. And I could, because I did know that she was very experienced in that area. And I was genuinely looking for help in that area as well.
I think what's interesting about that story is that these are two female senior executives talking to each other, right? So you're a female founder. And I think we talked about it briefly in the past. But I think what's interesting for me is I think you're very much one of the first wave of female founders and executives that I know building startups. Obviously, since then, over the past 4 years, many more female founders emerging. But I'm just curious, how have you seen that aspect or domain from your perspective?
So I was quite heavily involved with the female founder groups and everything until we got really busy, maybe a year or so ago. So what I think about it is that as at that point in time, female founders, they do have certain characteristics that distinguishes them from male founders. And what I see this as a rule of time, I'm not saying that every female founder does this, but I see it in myself, I see it in some others as well, is that we do tend to undersell ourselves to a certain extent. And we do tend to maybe under-promise, but over-deliver. I think that's actually great for investors, right? So we are actually an arbitrage opportunity if any investors are listening to this out there.
Invest in underconfident women.
Ties in very well.
Okay, fine, we'll say that anyway. Invest less in overconfident males or overpriced for their brand premium.
Exactly.
Because there are arbitrage opportunities in women.
So I need you to sell this into the investor community. But I do see many very positive characteristics of women founders, and that is that they have a lot of grit. So they really, you throw challenges at them, they thrive on it, they chew it, they eat it up for breakfast. I wouldn't say what it is more for male kind of founders, but in general for female founders, that is true. There are things I feel that female founders can improve on, but there are things that I feel that they're already currently very strong at. And I see a lot more female founders nowadays than the point in time where I first started out. And I do think that is a very good evolution.
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree with you. I think over the past 4 years, there's been a big shift from my perspective as well. I think it's interesting what you said about underselling as well, right? The truth is anybody can be inconfident and anybody can undersell regardless of gender. But I think I have noticed that as well. I think one case I had was I was doing a podcast interview. And at some point I just paused the interview and I said, you need to stop self-disqualifying. Because you say something really good, but before that, this might be wrong, and then you say this really good point, and I'm like, you've got to delete this phrase. Because it's just, it's like, this is really good coffee, but you may not like it, so it's a weird disqualification phase.
Yeah, it's strange. Because you are a father as well, right?
Yeah,
two daughters. So I have 3 kids. 1 is a boy, 2 are girls. And funnily enough, I see this in my own kids as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. For the boy, he may say things with a lot of confidence, which may not be correct. And the daughter may say things without much confidence. She's correct every step of the way, right? So I do not know whether this is something that was inculcated in them from young, from preschool onwards. I consciously do try to correct it when I see it. But yeah, I think it's just built in from young.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting piece, right? Because we're both parents as well. Obviously, your kids are older than mine. But I'm just curious because a lot of founders as well, they really struggle with the concept of being a founder and being a parent. So many times I have met founder friends who are like, now's not a time to be a parent because I'm so busy at work. And I've also met so many other parents who are like, I want to be a founder, but my parents are so busy. So I'm just curious from your perspective, any advice that you have for folks who, I don't know, either side, founders want to be parents or parents want to be founders?
So it's interesting, but I've not experienced this thought before. In fact, I think I founded my first company when my daughter was like 2 years old, 1 or 2 years old. So I do think that founding a company is very much like having a kid, right? So I am pretty sure you can attest to that as well.
Yeah, I agree.
So if you can actually have a kid and the kid's thriving, I think that there's no reason to doubt why you can also be a good founder. But I do think it also depends on what kind of founder you want to be and what kind of parent you want to be. So if you look at me as a parent, I'm not a tiger parent, right? The reason why I'm not a tiger parent, first, philosophical. I don't believe in that. But okay, maybe secondly, because my husband is a tiger parent, so he's like compliments for that. But
now I know. I'm like, it's a cool, Bernard is always cool, Analyze Asia, obviously Dodge AI, but now I know who is a parent.
Yeah, now I know who the tiger parent is.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thirdly, I don't have time to be a tiger parent. And I think that many founders don't as well. But I do intuitively believe that it's good for my kids that I'm more of a laissez-faire parent, right? I set goals for them. I help them set goals. I help them set guidelines. If they need help, I help them see the rationale of why they should be doing things in a certain way. It does take more effort in the beginning, but then it becomes a lot less effort towards the end because they become very self-directed and independent. So that's that on the parenting side. And then also on the founder side as well. As I mentioned, it depends what kind of founder you want to be. So I can imagine if I were the same type of founder that I was 4 years ago, where I was trying to do every single thing myself, it is going to be very difficult to cope with that kind of workload and the workload of being a parent. But if you're a founder who is able to set clear goals, clear expectations for the team, clear OKRs, have proper measuring standards, tracking standards, and you let your team get on with it, you hire good people, you let them get on with it, then that also reduces the amount of like day-to-day kind of things that you have to do. So I think that these two are good combinations and they're quite complementary as well. It is basically about trusting the other person, whether it's your employee, whether it's your team member, or whether it's like your child.
Yeah. And I think this would be fun to discuss, right? Because I think for the founders who want to be parents, from my perspective, I often tell them, I said, first of all, it's a two-person decision. And if you're adopting it, sometimes it's often the spouse who wants that. And I said, if you don't fulfill your spouse's life dream of having a kid, you're in deep trouble. I'm just saying, right? Because like if the founder wanted to have the kid, he already have the kid, but he or she will have the kid. But if you're saying like, oh, I don't know if I should have a kid or not, I'm saying like, what does your spouse think? And if your spouse wants to have a kid, then you pulling back for the sake of the business is destroying the life dream of your partner. And so you understand there's a cost to the marriage as well. I think that's one side. And that's like the part I also like to say is it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to have a kid. So if there's you want to be a parent, because I think there's so many startups you can build in your life, right? I don't know, what do you think about that?
Out of curiosity, the founders that you spoke to who expressed reluctance to have kids, were they male founders or female founders?
I've met both, male and female. I think for male ones, it would be primarily because they feel like they should be doing more at work. I think that's one. And I think that in the scenario of the two female founders I've talked about this issue, I think they're more about the fact that they feel like they're not, I think it's a mixture of they don't feel like they'll be a good parent.
Okay.
Because of the business, which is a bit of a different flavor from what I just talked about. And the other part is I also feel like, how would the landscape or VCs view a pregnant founder? I think that'll be the different type of flavor.
Okay, sorry. And what was your question?
I'm curious, what advice would you give to founders who want to be parents?
I would say that, especially for women, it's going to be a lot harder to be a parent the older you get, right? As opposed to doing it later, they should probably consider doing it earlier if the circumstances allows, right? That is one thing, because I think beyond a certain stage, it becomes very difficult and maybe almost impossible to become a parent.
Yeah.
Or there may be certain like consequences or side effects. So there is never a good time to be a parent, I feel. And this brings me back to the Nike slogan, right? Just do it.
Oh, so funny. I think it's true. The thing that you remind me of is, as a parent, like the early is obviously like a bit of a I don't know what a curve is, but it's like
There is a
good, and
curve.
then there's
Yeah.
a cliff
Even
effect.
for men as well.
The cliff effect
Yeah.
for men as well. So to some extent, it's okay for a certain time window, and after it falls off a cliff, it just gets
Yes.
really hard.
Yes.
And so to some extent, time is your enemy becoming a parent.
Mhm.
But actually, for a founder, it's actually also the opposite, right? Which is that as you get older, you have more financial resources, you're more stable, you're a better manager. So to some extent, time is your friend in becoming a better manager and founder over time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that is contrary to a lot of the popular Silicon Valley kind of belief that you have to be a founder in your early 20s. Yeah, now kind of thing. But exactly what you said, and I think statistically as well, it has been shown that actually the most successful founders are those that actually did it later in life, when they have more financial resources, or actually when they also have more experience in an industry and a better network of contacts.
And I think that's really the crux of it, is that I think it's very fair. I think people feel like they have to do the startup now, and they feel like they want to push back the parent decision later, if that makes sense. Versus now that I'm a parent and also a startup, I most feel like it's the other way around. Because like you said, I have so many friends who are struggling or going through IVF now, and sometimes IVF is not succeeding, right? Because it's just biologically not the right situation. Like the window for becoming a parent disappeared without them knowing it disappeared. And also, the IVF process is not as if it's like, by the way, if I'm later, I'll just do IVF.
Very expensive and painful process.
Exactly.
And with a high failure rate.
Exactly.
Yes.
So you and I were thinking the exact same thing, which is, I think people always say that, and I'm like, dude, like, it's not easy for the woman, and it's definitely not easy for the man either, because you're just like, all the pain that you're both going through as a family, as an emotion, is just, what a nightmare. So I think that's one side of it. How about for those who are parents working to be a founder, right? Other side of it is like, any, I don't know, is it like productivity hacks? Or is it like work at 8 p.m. at night after kids go to sleep? I don't know how.
Parents working as founders, whether they're hacks. I think as Bernard would tell you, I'm not a big believer in hacks. I'm a big believer actually in reduction of the amount of things that you're trying to do, so that you can focus on what the most important things are. I actually do spend a lot of time every weekend thinking about what are the things I should not be doing, and then taking those things out of my calendar or out of my to-do list, or delegating them to other people. Yeah, so that's my Sunday kind of habit. And that helps me to clear up the week, hopefully to focus on things that I really should be doing in order to get the ball rolling.
Yeah. And I guess the interesting part is, from your perspective, people often say like something like, oh, parents tend to be much more efficient or effective about their work.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true from your perspective?
Of course, that's true. And I would say that probably mothers are the most efficient people of all, because you just cannot afford to waste time on things that are not going to yield results. So yeah, I would say that is definitely true. I would believe that parents will be quite good at delegation. Parents will be quite good at seeing what is essential to do and what is not essential to do, and therefore save both themselves and also their team members a lot of wasted time and effort otherwise.
Yeah. I guess one interesting dynamic here is that there's a certain set of decisions to be made in life, right? Being a parent, being a good parent, which is two different.
It depends what your definition of good is.
Exactly. But
mine might be different from yours.
Yeah, exactly. So those are two different decisions, of course. And then obviously being a founder and scaling your business. Do you find that friends ask you for advice about this? Because you are both, right? I guess you're a parent, you're a founder. I guess in this case, of the conversation we had, you're a mother, you're a female founder in that context. So people ask you for advice, or what kind of advice would people look for you from?
With regards to whether or not they should be a parent, I think once or twice in the past, but I don't hear that too often. I think most of the time people are asking me for advice on like, how do you grow the business? How do you scale the business? Those kind of things. How do you get leads in and so on. So usually I very willingly share with them whatever I've learned up to that point in time.
And when you talk about the business advice, slowly to wrap things up here, is what has been the best advice that you've ever given in regards to the business side of
have given.
I don't know. Oh, I mean, we have reshared it. But I'm just saying, if people ask you advice on the professional side, I want to hear what's like.
I thought you were going to ask me what's the best advice that I've given.
I think both are fair game. So
yeah.
Best advice you've given versus best advice you've got. I'll take either of them.
Okay, best advice that I've got is basically focus on the right stuff, right? And don't always be looking at shiny new stuff. Focus on the fundamentals. Know very well what the fundamentals are, what is going to get you from A to Z. Just focus on that, and just focus on that every single day, and focus on getting better at those kind of things. So I would call it's not sexy, but I would call it incremental improvement. And actually, I think that is fundamental to building a real, sustainable, like high growth kind of company, because improvements every day compounds, growth compounds as well.
Yeah.
But going after something bright and flashy and raising a whole ton of money at a high valuation and having to meet an even higher valuation like 18 months later, that could kill the company right in the infancy.
I really agree about that. And last question I have here is, could you share any personal stories or inspirational moments that you've seen over the past few years?
So I would say, I think that the biggest recent incident of bravery that I've seen is someone who's very close to me, who had to start all over again. And this person is in his mid-30s, like recently married, recently bought a house and everything. The previous business didn't work out, and he had to start from the beginning again. And most recently, he was doing, I would say, person-to-person kind of sales. And he was doing it with a lot of vigor and doing it well. And that is something that really stands out to me as a very brave kind of action, right? To say, okay, I understand that I've reached rock bottom now, but I'm going to start climbing up from it.
And I think that, is that a midlife crisis or is that considered like a retrenchment? How do you see that reinvention?
I see it actually as something that anyone might have to go through at any point of their life, because they never know what's going to happen to them. It could be a health crisis, right? If it's a health crisis and someone does suffer a critical health issue, they will have to climb out of it again with like physiotherapy, with treatment. They might have to learn how to walk again and so on. It could happen with any entrepreneur because the business could at any point in time. How do you climb up of that financially, emotionally, mentally, and so on? It could be someone who has been working in a big corporation at any point, who's retrenched, and that's a very common incident going on now. And they might not be able to easily find another high-level executive position elsewhere. So how do they reinvent themselves, retrain themselves for something new, send out hundreds of job applications and go for all these interviews and try to climb out of it? So I think it's something that in this period of chaos that really defines our world right now and all these industries, it's really something that a lot of people would have to go through. And I think that the more often we speak about this, the more often it is made known publicly that other people are going through similar things, the easier it makes it for these people to climb out of the hole that they're in.
Yeah. On that note, thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to summarize the 3 big takeaways you got from this conversation. First of all, thanks so much for sharing about the evolution of Esevel in terms of, I think, not just the geography, in terms of the reach, but also in terms of the products and the strategy behind it. And I thought it was fascinating also to hear your personal decision maker reflections, right? Versus hindsight versus forward thinking, and actually really it being an iterative process built upon the customer's trust. I thought it was a fascinating piece. Secondly, thanks so much for sharing about your own personal changes as well over the past several years.
In addition to my haircut, yes.
In addition to your haircut, your red color, hair
yes.
color, which if we do have a video recording from the past will be a difference, yes. And so I thought it was just interesting to hear about your own, I think, like professional evolution in terms of how you decide to really be focused on delegating, or more importantly, about what are your strengths, what are you playing towards, and I think also getting some of that feedback from your peers and team as well. And lastly, thanks so much for sharing some advice for a common question that I've received, which is about parenthood and being a founder. And I'm glad that you and I got to have a discussion about, hypothetically, if they had advice, then this would be some of the key points that we'll cover about there never being a good time, and thinking to yourself, parenthood is time your enemy or friend, and that in startup life, actually time is your friend in terms of building your experience and skill set. So I think it's really helpful. So on that note, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeremy.